Art Rocks is made possible by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Chelsea Norris with Ann Connolly Fine Art, filling in for James Fox-Smith. We begin with a professor who taught rhetoric, writing, and culture on the collegiate level for 50 years. The stories Lillian Bridwell-Bowles studied and taught informs much of her work in clay. Lilly shares her story with us.
I taught a lot of literature and a lot of rhetorical work where the power of persuasion, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. And I've always been interested in mythology as well, so naturally works like the Iliad appealed to me, and I taught the Iliad many times. And I taught Plato's dialogues. I guess that's the connection. The imagery that appealed to me in the literature that I taught is now calling out to me as I try to create some original works in clay. In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, which I taught for many years because of what he says about rhetoric and persuasion, he tells a story, it's embedded in the dialogue, in which he says that Thoth, the Egyptian, the ibis-headed god with the big beak, invents hieroglyphs and astronomy and mathematics and all kinds of things, but he's also the scribe to the gods. He writes everything down. So if you look at some of the tombs in Egypt, he's everywhere because he's writing the story of the deceased in his journey across toward everlasting life. Thoth meets the king of Egypt and says, "Have I got something good for you? You need this. It will make you powerful beyond all power. It's the power of writing." The king of Egypt says, "No, thank you. It will be the death of memory." And so in my academic work, I used that story many times to talk about Google being the death of memory, writing things down, storing them, and not carrying them around in the oral culture could very well be the death of memory for a lot of things. That story out of Plato was very meaningful to me. So I went and looked at images of Thoth. And of course, he's in a Mardi Gras parade in New Orleans, so you have all these Mardi Gras beads with a big ibis-headed thing. I found him, and I found him inscribing hieroglyphs in the Egyptian Book of Dead and many other things. One of the first big flat slab projects with bas-relief that I ever did is of Thoth writing hieroglyphs, and I put secret messages in it and all kinds of fun things. And I said to myself in my feminist mode, I bet there was a woman. I bet there was a woman goddess. She was hard to find, but I found her, and her name is Seyshot. And then I thought, let's do Seyshot. So I went and found one of her inscribing hieroglyphs. I did that one. And then I thought, okay, let's make it like the feminist reclamation stories where the woman gets no credit, but she actually did the work. So I have Seyshot writing hieroglyphs, and over next to her is Thoth, and he is looking over her shoulder, copying her, plagiarizing her. So that was a great story for my students who had to worry about plagiarism all the time. But it also is very meaningful to me because I think if you look at art history or any other history, up until at least the Renaissance, there's very little acknowledgement of the contributions of women. In the 80s, I discovered that my education had betrayed me. I had read only white Southern authors in my Southern literature study. It dawned on me and I said, whoa, I have to fix this. So I started reading basically only African American authors and predominantly African American women. And so it was there that I discovered a lot of the African folk tales and legends that have informed some of my goddesses, including my Okra goddesses. The Ghanaian goddesses came after a visit to the Whitney plantation. I went down there with my brother. We were looking at the other side of Southern history that we had not known as white people. And the Whitney Museum is just a wonderful source of that kind of thing. And the guide told us a story about the Ghanaian women who would weave okra seeds and plantain seeds into their hair so that when they were captured, and they knew they might be captured because there were slave traders all over the area, so they put these seeds in their hair so that when they got to wherever they were going to be taken, they could plant something that their children could eat. And that just stopped me in my tracks when I heard that story, because okra is my favorite vegetable. I'd known it all my life. To know that it had that kind of history just stopped me cold. I came back and I'd seen some Ghanaian statues that they were selling in the gift shop. I just sat and thought about that for a long time and created those Ghanaian okra goddesses. I called them Goddess de Gombo, because gombo is the Ghanaian word for okra. How did I start throwing pots and playing in clay? I call it therapy for the academic life. When I came to Louisiana, I was at LSU and I was involved in administration and trying to build programs and so on, back when LSU was actually growing and building things. And it was stressful because people liked things the way they'd always been, and trying to get people to do some new things. But at the end of the day, I needed some kind of relief, and art has always been my escape valve. And so I discovered this group of potters in Baton Rouge, and you could rent a little space and use all of their equipment, and many of them had trained at LSU and the wonderful ceramics program there, so I knew about them. So I went in and just turned myself over to them and said, I want to play with clay. This piece was inspired by a Newcomb pot that I saw in New Orleans at the Newcomb Gallery. It's called Grand Isle, and it's probably about this tall and very much shaped like an urn. And the story that the Newcomb designer wrote about it was that it represented the tide pool on Grand Isle. So I went down to Grand Isle, looked around, didn't see any tide pools that I could get inspired by. So I went back to the Newcomb pot and studied the design of it, which is really quite complex. There are 4 points at the top of the pot, and then the tide swirls down from each of the 4 points. It was quite a complex design. It looks simple on the pot, but it isn't. I love the fauna and flora of Louisiana, and it reminds me of my home in Florida. So I've always worked with things like that. So dragonflies and these lovely little anoles. I saw a pot at the LSU Museum of Art, a Newcomb pot, that it's blue and white, and it had 4 anoles around it, and I said, okay, I'm going to go home and put anoles all over things, because I remember them from my childhood. They were everywhere, and they're all over my garden. I like to throw, but I get bored easily, throwing round things over and over and over again. I have to do more with the art. You can decorate round things beautifully. I started making my own clay round things to design, and then flat slabs that I could work on at my bench and get more detail into. And it's also better ergonomics because it doesn't require hunching over a round pot all the time. Or I could make flat strip, decorate it with motifs that I had made in my own stamps, and then form them around a rolling pin to make a round cup. So a lot of the cups that you see behind me are slab built. They're not thrown. I can throw a round cup if I want to, but I love taking that slab, putting it on my workbench, and adding my motifs to it. I probably have 100 stamps back there on my workbench, and each one of those stamps is some image that I have found somewhere that I love, and I use it over and over on certain pieces. This is a shell, and the way I make them is that I just make a slab, I cut out the shape of the thing, and then I carve it so that anywhere I've carved here, that will be raised on my slab when I stamp it. This is another stylized shell, has little bumps at the top when you press it. But I also take imagery from Ghanaian folk tales, for example. This is the Sankofa bird. And in the Sankofa story, the tale is that it is not taboo to look back to save that which is in danger of being lost. So in the stamp you have the bird, and it's looking back over its shoulder to retrieve an egg that was in danger. I made this thistle for some Caledonian society, actually for a silent auction. I've repeated this thistle on cups and various plaques that they enjoy. For the orchid pots, I throw a round pot, very simple, low fire, red clay. And when it's leather hard, which any potter understands, hard enough to manipulate, but not so hard that you can't cut it, I cut holes in the orchid pot. And sometimes I use a cookie cutter, so if I want little hearts, I can have little hearts in it, or whatever inspires me. I don't really want to market my pots. I like it when there's a reason why someone wants something in clay, and I can do that. When people commission something from me, they often have something very symbolic and important to them that they want me to try to capture.